I will say the vast majority of Democrats are pro-law enforcement, and we believe that law enforcement...
Walz, he says they're Gestapo.
Let me finish.
He says they're Gestapo.
Scott,
do you agree?
Scott,
do you
let
agree?
me finish.
This isn't just another panel. It's a debate about a tragic ICE shooting and what accountability means in a democracy. If you believe in progress and inclusion, subscribe and join us. Ana Navarro sits across from Scott Jennings. Abby Phillips moderates. On the surface, it's analysis. Underneath, it's a simple question. When federal power and civilian life collide, who gets the benefit of the doubt? That's the tension we're about to see.
Let's watch it.
Ana Navarro has joined us at the table. Ana, there were a lot of people who warned that, a massive increase in ICE presence on the ground would inevitably result in American citizens being the victims of some of these encounters.
Yeah, to me, this day is very, very somber because I think there were so many indications that this was going to end up happening sooner or later. And it's a day where I think we need to be very sober. And I think, a few things. First, we live in America. We have a right to protest. We have a right to videotape what is happening and amplify the truth. But for the videos that were taken today, we wouldn't know the truth. And we wouldn't be seeing it with our own eyes and able to judge it. Also, I think it's negligent that the ICE forces have been increased so quickly and that there's people without the proper training and the proper experience. I don't know if this agent who shot this woman today, I don't know if he's one of the new recruits that got offered $50,000 and maybe has less training and experience than ICE agents regularly do. And that might have been a contributing factor to how this ended up. Maybe if it had been an agent with more experience, the response would have been different. What I do know is that there's a 6-year-old boy who's now orphaned. His father died in 2023, and today his mother got shot to death. And I think it's a time of reflection in America. Protesters need to be peaceful. Protesters have every right to show up and demand accountability. But I also think our government has to be responsible in who they put out in the streets armed and the tone of what's happening with ICE. We've seen some agents really abuse power and almost relish what they are doing. We have seen pregnant women dragged through the streets. We have seen children left alone in cars. We have seen people shot. We have seen people chased like animals. Look, it's a very difficult situation, and we've got to reflect on how we do this so that it doesn't continue happening.
As you mentioned, it did seem to some people that we were headed in this direction because a couple of months ago, there was an incident involving another shooting with ICE agents. They shot into a vehicle and shot a woman. Then they charged her with trying to ram the law enforcement, but those charges were dismissed by a judge in part because of contradictory evidence that contradicted the ICE account of what happened in that incident. And I think all of this, to Anna's point, raises questions, Chair Michael, for me, about this pact that we have between law enforcement and the citizenry, that under normal circumstances, when you get a badge and a gun, it's a huge amount of responsibility. And that responsibility also comes with, you show your face, you're accountable, you report to someone, and you also have, you have rules that you abide by. And that feels like the part that's missing here with ICE, that they've decided ICE agents don't need to show their faces. They don't need to abide by some of the basic principles that regular law enforcement officers do, even though they're engaging with the population at much greater degrees than they used to. Is it a moment to think about that and think about whether that is sustainable?
I'm sure I'm not opposed to having conversations about extended training. Look, if one wants to raise questions about shortening training, if you're going to have agents who don't typically act in law enforcement roles, I would not be opposed to that from my experience with law enforcement, broadly speaking. But even with well-trained officers, we have seen instances where officers have to make split decisions. And sometimes it's not nice. we shouldn't jump to conclusions by calling this guy a murderer. We don't know yet. We have no clue.
Michael Singleton is trying to sound reasonable here. Calm, measured, and in theory, he's right. Even well-trained officers sometimes have to make split-second decisions. But here's where that framing falls apart. That's not what people believe happened in Minneapolis. The footage shows a woman speaking calmly. She says, "I'm not angry at you, dude." She appears to be trying to move her car and leave. And then the ICE officer pulls out his gun and fires 3 times. Afterward, according to the account in this discussion, he uses an expletive toward her. That's not an abstract conversation about pressure. That's a specific sequence of events. And specificity matters in a democracy. Now, there's been mention that the officer may have previously been dragged by a car. If that's true, that could explain heightened fear. But explanation is not the same as justification. If prior trauma affects how force is used, then the responsibility shifts to leadership and training. That's a structural question, not a partisan one. And this is where the larger contradiction comes into focus. ICE leadership and figures like Stephen Miller have publicly emphasized aggressive enforcement targets, numbers like 3,000 arrests a day, expanding operations into places like Home Depot and 7-Eleven. The stated goal is to remove the worst of the worst, violent criminals, public safety threats. Most Americans agree with that goal. But when enforcement expands broadly and agents operate masked without visible identification, it changes public perception. Accountability becomes harder to see. And when accountability feels distant, trust erodes. Ana Navarro argues the tone is wrong, that it feels excessive and opaque. Scott Jennings later frames the issue as binary. Are Democrats pro-law enforcement, or are they calling agents Gestapo? But that framing ignores something fundamental. You can support law enforcement as an institution and still question how a specific agency is operating. You can back public safety and still demand transparency. In fact, in a constitutional democracy, those two things are supposed to go together. Because when force is used in the name of the state, especially lethal force, scrutiny isn't hostility, it's civic duty. And that tension between authority and accountability is exactly what's erupting in this exchange.
Oh, that's difficult to say. Someone has died. I acknowledge that. There's a child who's lost another parent. That doesn't make me comfortable or as a human being at all. But I do believe you have to empower law enforcement officials to do their jobs while assuring that you're also protecting the constitutional rights of citizens. And that's just the way I look at this.
But this looked to me like there was something very wrong because, I mean, you know, this ICE officer shot at least 3 times that we could hear on the video with other ICE officers very close to the driver, with people all around the car, with a moving car situation happening, which resulted into that car careening into another car and a tree and could have caused even more death and injuries. So I think we've got to acknowledge all of those things. I saw earlier today the former mayor of Miami-Dade, Carlos Jimenez, who is now a Republican from South Florida, a congressman from South Florida, huge Trump supporter. But when he was mayor of Miami-Dade, and he's also been a fireman for over 20 years. When he was mayor of Miami-Dade, he was the chief executive of the police department. And Jake asked him how he felt about this. And he said, "I'm not ready to defend the ICE officer. I have serious questions." And I think we need to take off our partisan hats, and we need to look at this with, be very cold-headed, because what we need to work on is make sure to avoid these kind of situations in the future.
Chris Murphy said Democrats cannot vote for a DHS budget that does not restrain the growing lawlessness of this agency. And increasingly, Lee, I'm hearing and seeing a lot of Democrats basically saying, back when defund ICE was a position that some liberals were taking and moderates were saying, well, that's gone too far. Now more and more so-called moderates are saying this agency is out of control. When we retake power, we've got to do something about it. Do you think that's the right move?
I think any agency that has this much money behind them needs to have accountability, and it doesn't have that. And I think if there's any question to what Shermichael's making and what Anna is saying, this idea of like, we don't really know what happened. We don't know what the officer was thinking in this moment. It might come down to training. It might not come down to training. It looks like this. It looks like that. At the end of the day, she was pulled out of the car and she was not dead yet. And a doctor was on the scene and tried to help her. And the ICE officer said, get away from her or we'll shoot you. So they shot a woman and then threatened to shoot a man who was trying to help the woman. So if you're telling me that this was just a split-second decision, she might have been saved. But her wife had to watch her bleed out on the ground while a doctor stood by with an ICE officer with a gun in his face. So I don't know what we're talking here.
In that aftermath.
Well, they've spoken to the doctor.
Right. No, yeah. And I think my point is that what transpired after she was shot, did they render aid? Did they allow aid to be rendered to her? Again, this is all part of the picture that Americans are seeing, and they're asking, what's going on here?
Well, they're all fair questions and should all be part of a legitimate investigation. I think that's what the American people would expect.
Let's slow this down, because notice the contrast being pointed out here. On one hand, commentators like Michael Singleton are urging patience. Let's not jump to conclusions. Let's wait for the investigation. That sounds measured, responsible. But then, according to this excerpt, within 2 hours, Kristi Noem publicly labeled the woman a domestic terrorist, claiming she tried to kill an ICE agent with her car and that he acted in self-defense. Soon after, J.D. Vance and others in the administration echoed that framing. Here's what that really exposes. You can't call for calm deliberation on television while senior officials are already delivering a verdict. That's the contradiction. If the standard is wait for the facts, that standard has to apply to everyone, especially those in power. Now, to be precise, those statements reflect the administration's interpretation of events at that time. But when a tragedy occurs, and the immediate response from leadership is to define the victim as the aggressor before a full public accounting, it shapes the narrative instantly. It signals where the state stands. And this is where democracy meets something more fragile. In a healthy system, investigations determine facts. Public officials don't pre-write the conclusion. When they do, it creates the perception that the outcome is predetermined, that the badge is defended first, and the evidence is sorted out later. That's the psychological shift people react to. Because it's not just about one shooting. It's about whether accountability mechanisms are real or rhetorical. When questions about ICE funding, oversight, and operational transparency are already on the table, a rapid, one-sided defense only deepens skepticism. And here's the structural issue. When power speaks first and loudest, it influences public understanding before independent review can even begin. That imbalance is what concerns many critics, not law enforcement itself, but the appearance of reflexive institutional protection. The deeper fear isn't disagreement, it's erosion of trust. If leaders appear to choose a side before the evidence is fully examined, people start asking whether investigations are meant to discover truth or to justify it. That's the tension at the heart of this moment.
I mean, a lot of people witnessed this. There have been a lot of witnesses on television today. We played some. I saw another interview with another witness who said that this lady in the van was the leader of a convoy that was attempting to impede and obstruct the road where legitimate law enforcement operations were taking place. I would also like to know if that is true, because that's what an eyewitness has said. If that is true, I think one of the questions we have to ask is, why are people believing that it is okay to create vehicle convoys for the purpose of impeding federal law enforcement? My suspicion is it's because they've been told by politicians that it is their responsibility to do so. It is, in fact, a felony to obstruct federal law enforcement activities. If you don't like the immigration laws, that's a legitimate position, but you don't change laws by creating convoys to obstruct law enforcement officers. You call the politicians and ask them to change the laws. Political vigilantism is getting people killed. This lady should not be dead. I hate it that she is dead, because this poor kid, as Anna said, is an orphan. I don't love in any way, shape, or form that someone is dead, but we have to ask ourselves hard questions about why people are putting themselves in these positions. And we've seen it all over the country.
Because they're Americans and they can't stand what they are seeing. I don't think it's.
Does that mean you can impede a law enforcement officer?
No, but that wasn't the case on January 6th either. And they were pardoned. And just this week, they were marching down the street to the Capitol again. Why are you shaking your head?
Because
you
this cannot be your go-to.
But no, I'm not saying that.
On January 6th,
I am pro law enforcement.
Democrats said we're pro law enforcement. Today they say they're Gestapo. Which is it? Which is it?
No.
I have to say, Scott Jennings is actually very skilled at what he does. But the skill lies in a kind of intellectual sleight of hand. He thinks in a rigid binary. You are either pro-law enforcement or law enforcement is Gestapo. There's no room for nuance, no space for accountability, no acknowledgement that institutions can be both necessary and flawed. But let's be clear. The officers defending the Capitol on January 6th were not acting like Gestapo. And yet, ICE agents who shoot people in their car multiple times, allegedly because they don't like their attitude. That's an entirely different situation. That's a pattern of behavior that cannot be excused as split-second decision-making. You can absolutely support law enforcement when it operates under clear rules, when it is transparent, when its mission is to serve and protect. But you can also be critical and even oppose an agency when it behaves like ICE does today, hiding faces, refusing to identify themselves, acting with impunity, overfunded, marching through streets without warrants, dragging people from cars, and in some cases, forcibly deporting individuals to foreign countries. This isn't hypothetical. This is happening in real time. It's alarming. It's Orwellian. And it's been going on for months with little public pushback. Until now, people are sick of it. Let's rewind for a moment. Scott Jennings does something particularly sneaky. He says, a lot of people saw this. I heard one person say that this woman was the leader of a convoy of radical leftists. Notice how he doesn't name anyone. Convenient. But even if we grant that statement, it assumes ICE's actions were legitimate from the start. And then, in his twisted logic, that could somehow justify lethal force. She's trying to drive away. She's not threatening anyone. But through a few huge leaps of logic and morality, that scenario is reframed as justification for murder. For months, Jennings and other MAGA pundits seemed somewhat embarrassed, trying to defend the indefensible while maintaining a veneer of civility. But now, that hesitation is gone. They are unapologetic. They are emboldened. Stephen Miller's mantra, might makes right, is no longer just words on paper. It is reflected in the streets through ICE's actions. The unspoken rule is, she shouldn't have resisted. She shouldn't have spoken back. She shouldn't have existed as an independent actor. If she had simply complied, she wouldn't be dead. That's what this system communicates. Obedience over humanity. It settles into a cold pit in your stomach. You watch and you realize what's happening. If this isn't fascism, what is? Walks like a duck, talks like a duck. How many examples do we need before it's undeniable? The state rushes to defend its stormtroopers before any investigation, before facts are gathered. ICE agent shoots woman. Woman is labeled a terrorist. ICE agent is declared a hero. Narrative set. Facts, irrelevant. Accountability, optional. This is textbook authoritarianism. Call it fascism, call it whatever you like, but it's not the America that values representative democracy, oversight, and rule of law. A small percentage of people may believe this is normal, signing up as ICE agents or deportation judges, thinking the machinery is working as intended. But for the rest of us, it's chilling, it's Orwellian, it's insane. I have made my position clear, but I recognize there are other perspectives. If you're watching Progressive Perspective, you may feel the same as I do, but I also know there are viewers who see it differently. And that's why I want to hear from you. I want your good faith take. Are we at a turning point? How far will this go? How do we respond? This is not a hypothetical question anymore. It's happening now. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Let's talk about what happens next.